When Narcissists Collide, Part 1. Many people are curious to know what happens when there is some narc-on-narc action. Do they recognize one another? Do they seek one another out? How do they react around one another? Do they gang up, and is there a pack mentality? Can narcissists work together? Can two narcissists have a successful romantic relationship? As you know, I categorize our kind into categories and schools of narcissist. The latter is linked to awareness, ability, and cognitive function, and therefore this is what is relevant when considering whether our kind recognize one another. Addressing that question first is straightforward. The lesser and mid-range narcissists don't know what they are, and therefore they are unable to accurately recognize their own kind. Mid-range narcissists will throw around the label of somebody else being a narcissist, but invariably they get it wrong, and they will accuse a genuine victim of being a narcissist. They may occasionally get it right, but that is just serendipity. They've just thrown the label out there, and they happen to be ensnared in some way with another narcissist, and therefore they've got it right. They aren't actually able to recognize it instinctively. The greater narcissist, or the ultra, much rarer beasts, are aware of what we are, and we don't admit it. However, we are able to recognize others of our kind. With this platform of awareness and recognition, what then transpires when narcissists collide? Well, let's get down to the basement. Time for a wrestle in the mud. And let's start off with lesser narcissist against lesser narcissist. Two lesser narcissists can readily become entangled as a consequence of being related. The existence of a familial connection means that there is actually no need for seduction between the two lesser narcissists. If, for instance, the two lesser narcissists are two brothers, then, whenever they interact, they will seek to control one another and draw fuel from one another. This will manifest as the direct assertion of control and seeking to outdo one another or demand attention from one another. For instance, a lesser victim narcissist would want his brother to help him get down the stairs. His sense of entitlement demands this assistance, and it is his way, unconsciously, of asserting control over the brother. The brother, a lesser somatic, may agree to assist in the expectation of receiving positive fuel from the LVN's appreciation and thanks, and therefore it suits his purpose to assert control by helping. This is less likely, however, to be forthcoming from the lesser victim narcissist, and therefore his failure to be appreciative of the assistance provided by his brother will result in a threat to the lesser somatic's sense of control, again unconsciously, over the lesser victim. Because now the lesser somatic's control has been threatened, he must do something to fight against the threat to his control, and he will shift from a benign direct manipulation, which was offering the assistance, to a malign direct manipulation, which would, for instance, be mocking his brother for his lack of mobility, his poor physical prowess, and as a consequence of the LSN needing to assert control because the LVN did not express sufficient thanks and appreciation for the LSN helping him. Alternatively, it might be the case that the LVN demands the assistance of his more agile brother to help him down some stairs, but the LSN sees no reason to help. He's not a carer, he has no sense of accountability, and of course no emotional empathy, and therefore his narcissism views the request from his LVN brother as a threat to his control, and he asserts control by refusing to assist. The failure to assist, of course, is a threat to the control of the LVN, and if the response is one of refusing to help and has not provided any fuel, this will wound the LVN, his fury is ignited, and then he will lash out at the LSN sibling, trying to assert control over him. For instance, name-calling him, saying, "You should spend less time in the gym and more time helping me." He will form this view because he needs the help, and hell, he's entitled to it. And as a consequence, those two lesser siblings, a lesser somatic and a lesser victim will bang up against one another as they repeatedly clash, trying to assert control and gain control and reject threats to their own control. It is like two rutting stags. Two lesser siblings, of course, will actually provide plenty of fuel to one another, because often they will erupt with ignited fury, and their rage manifests as fuel. Therefore, that is not such a problem. The issue is, of course, the repeated threats to one another's control. The lack of consideration that they will have for one another, or where they feign it in order to try and gain an advantage, will result in the two railing against one another on a repeated basis. They will trade bad-tempered insults and physically fight, each gaining fuel from the other's rage, until one manages to assert control, for instance knocking the other one out, or one is forced to withdraw, or they're parted by the others. Unable to recognise that they are dealing with one of their own kind, and because they will treat one another as non-intimate secondary sources in their fuel matrices, they will keep coming together to assert control over one another, seeking fuel from one another, and therefore will clash. Sparks will fly, and then they will separate. The intermittent nature of their interaction, since they use one another as non-intimate secondary sources, means that their relationship will continue for a long time without disengagement, and is one that is marked by repeated turbulence. Basically, they will be known as the two brothers who don't get on most of the time. Outsiders, unaware of what they are, will regard two lesser siblings as competitive, argumentative, and repeatedly at loggerheads. They will covet one another's possessions, delight in trying to engage in an affair with their sister-in-law or the girlfriend of their sibling, all part of the manipulations designed to assert control over their other sibling. They will seek to outdo one another, aligned against one another because of what they are, but still drawn to one another through the familial bond and the need to assert control. What about two lesser narcissists who find themselves coming together in a social sense? Well, the initial seduction between the two will be effective, since neither is seeking to make the other a primary source, and therefore the usual instinctive checks for empathy, etc., will be less rigorous because of this, and also because the individuals concerned are lesser narcissists. It's extremely rare for two lesser narcissists to become friends in isolation. Instead, they are more likely brought together through the glue of other non-narcissists. Thus, for example, an empathic individual may have been ensnared by lesser narcissist A through, let's say, a football team, and through lesser narcissist B being neighbours. And thus, this empathic person might bring the two lessers together as part of a wider social circle. Thus, it is conceivable that they can become friends, most likely of the outer circle variety, and thus are non-intimate secondary sources towards one another within the fuel matrix. Similar to the situation of the familial lesser narcissist that I described earlier, the two social lesser narcissists will bump up against one another, trying to outdo one another, seeking to assert control over one another and draw fuel, clashing, arguing, falling out. Their behaviours will challenge the control of the other, resulting in an ignition of fury and the provision of fuel, and again their rage, their irritation, their annoyance, their frustration will be in short bursts before either one has asserted control over the other, or the other has withdrawn to assert control, and they are in essence back off from one another. Their interactions will be intermittent, and it is usually the case that the interactions will take place against the matrix of other non-narcissists being in attendance. Indeed, where those two friend narcissists in a group can't directly assert control over one another, they will turn to the non-narcissists and smear one another, thus indirectly asserting control. They, in effect, create divisiveness, drama, and trouble within that social group. The first lesser will seek to gain the approval of the social group. By doing so, he smears the second lesser. This, of course, is a threat to the control of the second lesser. He will resent this, and he'll lash out, and thus the argument will commence. There will be those within the group who regard the two as just having a personality clash, not truly understanding the dynamic, and will unfortunately spend their time trying to keep the peace and keep the two from attacking one another both verbally and physically. They will rut with one another as they seek to establish primacy of control within the group, and will always keep going and going until One has asserted control over the other, for instance, again through physical violence and putting them on their backside, or smearing to the other individuals, or by withdrawal. Once this happens, they then will break off and not bother with one another until the next occasion where they are brought together. The two lesser narcissists will not time spend with one another when nobody else is in attendance. You will not have two lesser friends operating in that way. They will need the non-narcissist friendship group around them to bring them together. The lack of a familial bond means that if it was just the two of them, they would go at one another until one knocked the other out, and there is little incentive for the two to socialize in isolation. They would need the non-narcissist to allow them to assert control through smearing, triangulation, etc. Instead, the social lesser narcissists are always brought together in a wider group where they will compete with one another against a backdrop of onlookers. In a work situation, the two lesser narcissists are brought together because of the connection of employment. There is therefore no seduction between them, but their link is already established. They will compete, not cooperate with one another, look to do the other down, and use third parties to try and elevate themselves against this person, who will be identified as a troublemaker and a competitor straight away. They will both be trying to assert control over one another, and those attempts will then also be viewed as threats to their control. Two lesser narcissists who are forced to work together will become an extreme headache for any HR or hardly relevant department. Unwilling to compromise, always blaming one another, shirking responsibility, looking to draw a reaction from one another, they are actually unlikely to get much work done, but instead spend their time trying to control the other. They would not be focused on trying to outdo one another, after all they are lesser, but instead they are more focused on trying to do the other down. So it's not a case of rising above, but trying to take the other one at the knees to make them smaller. Because if their competitor is beneath them, then they, by default, must be above them. And that is the way they would seek to assert control over one another, directly to begin with. If that doesn't work, indirectly by issuing complaints and smearing and triangulating, and ultimately withdrawing if need be. It is a tumultuous relationship of insults, accusations, and possibly even violence towards one another, which will lead either to the pair being split up so there is no interaction, or, most likely, both being dismissed. What of two lessers interacting as tertiary sources? Let's say one is a customer in a restaurant and the other is a waiter. They may, as strangers, get away with a brief dollop of positive fuel for one another. The waiter is pleasant and the customer begrudgingly thanks him. If the interaction is brief, they can both get away with a small amount of positive fuel, and then there's no threat to one another's control. If the interaction becomes longer, then there is an increased risk of them igniting one another's fury as they seek to assert control over one another, and the fact that as lesser narcissists, they have such a low threshold on this ignited fury. The customer lesser will perceive, through his narcissistic perspective, a criticism and a threat to his control through slow service, and therefore insults the waiter. The lesser waiter reacts to this and then throws a drink over the customer. Both gain an instant hit of fuel and seek to control one another. And the interaction will probably be brought to an end through the intervention of third parties. The two lesser narcissists, even as tertiary sources, can't exist alongside one another for long before the necessity of asserting control over one another results in problems. The low control threshold of the lesser means that any interaction with another lesser, either family, socially, work-wise, or interacting as strangers, will result in a flare-up between the two. Finally, what about two lessers coming together in the context of an intimate relationship? Can two lessers have one another as intimate partner primary sources? There is a risk of them trying to seduce one another because of their inability to recognize one another and their lower cognitive function, meaning they may not readily pick up on the lack of empathic traits. The seduction may commence, but then most likely may not be concluded, as both instinctively find that the other is too difficult to control because, of course, they both need to assert control over one another, which also means they're both threatening one another's control. And therefore this results in the seduction being broken off. They have enough instinct to recognise that the person they've started to seduce hasn't got what is required for the prime aims, and therefore, in their conscious minds, they will just think, she's a whore, he's an arsehole, and therefore they will break off the interaction. The real reason is they're not able to control one another, and the provision of the prime aims is affected, which results in the seduction failing. If, and this is rarer, two lessers become locked together in a romantic relationship, which makes one want to have a shower just thinking about it, then they try to make the other become the IPPS. This is unusual, but can happen because of the following. 1. Both have suffered the escape of an empathic IPPS who has left them, and therefore they've been plunged into chaos mode. With no pending IPPS in play, they are desperate to find one, and thus inadvertently hook up with another narcissist because of their desperation for the prime aims. Their weakened state and desperation will cause them to be far less instinctively choosy, or 2, they feign the appearance of empathic traits in order to trap the target, and owing to the lower cognitive function, and especially if there is no other potential for primary source to hand, they fail to detect that this is false, and are thus initially conned. Where two lesser narcissists fall for one another in such circumstances, the nature of the relationship will be turbulent and short-lived. Initially, continuing the seduction, they will provide limited positive fuel to one another. This is because, given their lesser energy levels, they will be focused on keeping the beast within under control, rather than laying on the charm and magnetism. Accordingly, there is not so much a golden period, but rather a bronze period. This poor positive fuel provision will make both lessers restless, irritable, and struggling to keep the beast under control. They may be pleasant to the other, in order to try to draw positive fuel when it is not forthcoming, because of course they are dealing with their own kind, who expects to receive the compliments and sees no reason to return them, and their low control threshold means that the lack of decent fuel will bring about devaluation very quickly. Accordingly, the bronze period between two lessers who have appointed one another as an IPPS will be short-lived, and will plummet towards devaluation very quickly. Both will lash out at one another, and this is when some decent fuel will be forthcoming as they erupt in a fury with one another. Unfortunately for them, the need to control and the ignition of the fury means that they need to replace that fuel used up by the fury, and therefore there will be an explosive eruption between the two, and they will then be forced, in effect, to withdraw as part of preserving themselves against the threat to control and, in their minds, asserting control over one another. They will be forced to seek fuel elsewhere, and, once sated, will return to one another, only for the next explosion to occur. So long as the lessers are able to control other people and draw fuel from them, they will keep returning and erupting with another turbulent vitriolic period of devaluation, and then this will continue until one or both find a more viable fuel source and a provider of the prime aims, who is much easier to control, i.e. an empath. Let us say that lesser A, finding the fuel from lesser B to be highly unsatisfactory and the threat to the control too great, finds an empathic secondary source and commences an affair. That empath is easier to control, and the fuel provision is far superior to that being provided by lesser B. Lesser A moves to promote the empathic secondary source to become the IPPS. Lesser A has now found the viable provider of the prime aims, who is easier to control, and thus will disengage from lesser B. Thereafter, lesser A will focus on the new IPPS and have no regard for lesser B. Lesser B perceives the loss of his IPPS, i.e. lesser A, as wounding. His fury is ignited, and he will, of course, look to apply an initial Grand Hoover to try and win back lesser A. This will fail. Lesser A will resist the Hoover because of what he or she is, and also because he or she will be infatuated with their new primary source. They will therefore regard lesser B as a troublemaker and likely to seek a restraining order against them, call the police, etc. Lesser B may well lash out at lesser A as a consequence of this further rejection, but will be forced very quickly to find an alternative primary source, because lesser A is no longer available and is causing repeated wounding through rejection. Once secured, lesser B, also having found a fresh empathic primary source, will focus on her or him. Accordingly, at that stage, lessers A and B will have no regard for one another and will not hoover, even when they devalue their newfound empathic primary sources, unless there are exceptional circumstances, because the pure poor fuel provision they experienced previously acts as a disincentive instinctively for them to return to the previous former IPPS who was a narcissist. Accordingly, in the romantic sense, the collision of two lessers is rare, and if it does happen, the relationship will be chaotic, brutal, and moreover short-lived, with the two unlikely to cross paths purposefully again thereafter. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.